Today on Datasheet Deep Dive, we're going to cover some very serious topics, and this is going to be a really heavy episode because we're talking about Heavy Intercessors. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and I am just getting over a cold, so if my voice is very hoarse and extremely nasally, as befits the nerd that we all know I am in my heart, that's why. And I apologize beforehand if it distracts anyone from the incredibly important topic that we are here to cover today. And that is, of course, the Heavy Intercessor Datasheet. Let's dive. As always on the Datasheet Deep Dive series, we're going to be diving into the datasheet of the Heavy Intercessor, talking about its strengths and its weaknesses, some ways that you can use it on the table in your Space Marine army, some synergies that you can use along with it to get the most out of your Heavy Intercessors, fun little comparison of all the little weird heavy bolters that they can take, before we move on to a final verdict and ask the question, should you put Heavy Intercessors into your army? That's a pretty important question, and another really heavy question for this episode is, will you subscribe to this video? You can just click on the button down there below. It helps support the channel. It lets me know what topics and what formats of video are popular with people, and I really appreciate it. I love you forever. So now all the love and affection is out of the way in this video, let's talk about something a little bit more brutal, and that is the Heavy Intercessor Squad Datasheet. These guys are a troops option for the Space Marine Codex, and interestingly, they're a troops option that wears Gravis armor, which is a mark of armor that is typically reserved for some of the more elite troops in the Codex. You might have seen it on something like maybe Inceptors, maybe some Eradicators, but now we get it in a troops option, so that's pretty cool. As befitting a unit with Gravis armor, the Heavy Intercessors come in at a pretty abysmal move of only 5 inches. They have a normal Space Marine attack stat line, weapon skill 3, ballistic skill 3, strength 4 with a base 2 attacks, which is okay, but what they're making up for with that low speed is a pretty decent defensive stat line, being toughness 5 with 3 wounds, and of course, the patented Space Marine 3+ power armor save. This is a very interesting stat line to have on a troops option, as all troops in a Space Marine detachment are going to get objective secured, so having those models be as difficult to kill as possible seems like it would be a pretty good idea. Now, the big downside of this unit comes at its points cost, which is 28 points per model, which it's a lot of points per model, especially when compared to other troops options like Tactical Marines or Intercessors at just 20 points. 28 is it's a lot. You do get a bit of an upgraded weapon selection, however. Heavy Intercessors get essentially the same selection of weapons that a standard Intercessor squad gets, but they get a special heavy version of them, which sports +1 strength and an extra 6 inches of range. So, in place of the normal Stalker bolt rifle that a standard Intercessor squad would get, the Heavy Intercessor squad gets an Executor bolt rifle. Instead of the regular bolt rifle, you get a heavy bolt rifle, and instead of an auto bolt rifle, you get the creatively named Hellstorm bolt rifle. And all of those are +1 strength, +6 inches of range over the equivalent that you would have in a normal Intercessor squad. Now, like the normal Intercessor squad, the entire unit has to take all the same weapons, so there's no mixing and matching of those different weapon options in here. And that goes even a little bit farther, because the Heavy Intercessor squad, unlike the standard Intercessor squad, does have a heavy weapon option, which is the Heavy Bolter, which is pretty cool. Heavy Bolters are pretty good. Some people, I think, misinterpreted this datasheet when it was first released. You only get 1 model per 5 with the Heavy Bolter. It's just like a standard heavy weapon option. I heard some people talking about taking full units of 10 with Heavy Bolters. You can't do that. It's just one guy or 2 if you take the full unit of 10 guys. There's also an additional catch with the Heavy Bolter option, which is that there are 3 varieties of Heavy Bolters that the unit can take. There's the Hellstorm Heavy Bolter, the Executor Heavy Bolter, and the Standard Heavy Bolter. And all of these are keyed to the rifle type that they take their name from. So a heavy bolt rifle can be upgraded to a Heavy Bolter, a Hellstorm bolt rifle can be upgraded to a Hellstorm Heavy Bolter, or an Executor bolt rifle can be upgraded to an Executor Heavy Bolter. However, you can't, for example, take a unit of guys with Hellstorm bolt rifles and then give them a standard Heavy Bolter. That's not okay. It's kind of a weird thing to me, but that is how how it works. You can only replace that rifle with that type of bolter. And so that's it. You're locked into that, whatever variety of bolt weapon that you wanted to take on your Heavy Intercessors for the entire unit, and no mixing and matching allowed. Now, the stat lines of the different Heavy Bolter profiles are pretty interesting. The Executor Heavy Bolter being basically a giant stalker bolt rifle, gives you one shot less than a standard bolter profile for an additional AP and an additional damage, which is a pretty big deal. The Hellstorm Heavy Bolter trades 6 inches of range and a point of AP for an additional shot, which is pretty good, but that is a relatively big trade, and the standard Heavy Bolter is the one we all know and love, Strength 5, AP 1 for a flat 2 damage, 3 shots at heavy, 3 at 36-inch range. Now, all of the Heavy Bolters in the unit cost 10 points, which is a pretty expensive heavy weapon, especially when you're equipping them to a 28-point troop model already. That means that this squad, at its base of 5 models, comes out at 140 points, an even 150 if you elect to take the Heavy Bolter on top of that. Now, the thing that they're missing down in this War Gear section is any variety of melee weapon. There's nothing in there. So unlike a standard Intercessor squad, you can't take a Power Fist or a Thunderhammer or a Power Sword on your Sergeant to give that squad a little bit more punch in melee. The Heavy Intercessor squad is focusing almost entirely on ranged attacks. It's going to obviously put out a lot more damage per model than a standard Intercessor squad with that extra strength and that heavy weapon option, but if it gets engaged, it's going to punch below its weight class, especially since, you can't even take a chainsword on the Sergeant. They're going to hit with less attacks than a standard Intercessor squad for a lot more points. So definitely keep that in mind if you're looking to put these guys on your list. They are not a frontline fighting unit, despite the fact that they're wearing Gravis armor, and it looks like they want to be up close and personal with your opponent. They are actually not good in melee at all. Like all other Space Marine infantry, they have the Angels of Death in Combat Squads rules, so if you do take a unit of 10, you can potentially split that into 2. Although if you are using them as your Bulwark unit, which we'll talk about later, then it is nice to potentially have a little bit of flexibility if you really need it and you're playing a spread mission, like Scorched Earth, for example. They also have a pretty good swath of keyword. They're infantry, obviously. They have the core keyword, which is great. They're Primaris, also great. And they have the Mark X Gravis keyword, which gives them access to the special Gravis stratagem. Now, interestingly, they have the Intercessors keyword, and they also have the Heavy Intercessor Squad keyword. But one of the most important attributes of a standard Intercessor squad is the rapid fire stratagem to let them double shoot. However, that requires the Intercessor Squad keyword, which the Heavy Intercessor Squad does not have. So despite being a Heavy Intercessor squad of Intercessors, they are not an Intercessor squad. So overall, what are we looking at in this data sheet? It's a little bit of an interesting combination of abilities. They're slow, they're durable, they shoot pretty well, but they pay for that in being expensive. Now, they are a troops option, which means that they innately have objective secured, which is great. You don't have to source any objective secured elsewhere to buff them up. However, on the downside, once they're on an objective, and especially a centrally located objective, your opponent can just engage them in melee, and they don't really punch back very well. They're still going to hit like a Space Marine, which is fine, but it's nothing to write home about. And a lot of times, you're going to want to be taking units that are a little bit more threatening and a little bit more punchy in melee to be your frontline fighters rather than these Heavy Intercessors. There are 2 ways to use this unit that I see. You can use them as a standard troops option in a Space Marine army, where they are normally a backline objective holder. You can screen with them. You can sit on your rear objectives or your flank objectives, and just put a pretty decent unit. A unit of Intercessors or Heavy Intercessors are going to be able to hold that down against a lot of your opponent's fast movers pretty well, because Space Marine infantry just tends to outperform a lot of other infantry. The downside is that you're paying a huge premium for that. So 28 points a model is going to be almost 50% more expensive than a standard Intercessor squad or an Incursor squad or something like that, and you're not getting any additional model count out of it. You're just buffing the ranged attacks and the survivability of that unit. The other thing that you can do with these guys is use them as a bulwark unit, like I mentioned before. This is something that a lot of Space Marine lists are going to want to build around, since Space Marines can concentrate a lot of their really powerful buffs on a single unit to make it like this unstoppable killing machine. A lot of Space Marine lists will want a big centralized Death Star unit that they can use to really bully objectives and run up the table. Your Indomitor kill teams, these big, really punchy units that you want to be spearheading your army as you move up the table. And I think Heavy Intercessor squads have an argument to be a unit like this. Now, the downside for them is that they're relatively slow, only have 5-inch movement speed, which is pretty damning. They also don't punch at all in melee, which is not very good. But the upside is that compared to a lot of other options that you can use in this slot, they're going to be relatively inexpensive. For 10 models, it's 280 points, 300 points even if you want to equip any heavy bolters to them. So you're a lot less expensive than something like a big unit of Terminators. You're a little bit more expensive than something like a unit of ATVs, but it is 30 wounds at toughness 5, and you can buff those with a lot of defensive buffs. We'll talk about those in the synergies. I mean, the big one that everyone's going to be talking about is the Chief Apothecary to give them all a 6+ damage ignore, and on top of that, bring back models every turn. And I think the big headliner is on top of this big Death Star unit that you can make very difficult to kill, they have objective secured, and if you have an ability like Steadfast Example that combines with objective secured, you can double them up so they actually count as 20 models when they're standing on an objective for the purposes of taking it, and really lock in central objectives that you want to be fighting over. So I think that's a really interesting place that Heavy Intercessors could be put, and it seems to me like that's the direction that the unit was meant to go in. I mean, why else would you put a unit with Gravis armor on the table if not to be a relatively close-up and in-your-face unit that's really going to put that resilience to its best use? So with these use cases for this unit in mind, we can move on to some synergies. Now, this is a core unit, which means they're going to have a boatload of synergies, and we would be here all day if we were going to cover every single one of them. So I'm just going to go over the ones that I think are the most important. If you have any that I missed, go ahead and throw them in the comments, obviously, and we'll talk about them down there. If you have any sweet combos you want to use with your Heavy Intercessors. Now, obviously, in addition to the core keyword, there's a ton of other abilities you can use out of the Space Marine Codex on these guys. They have their Primaris keyword, so they get affected by all of the Primaris stratagems, all of the core stuff like your rites of battle, your tactical precision, your litanies of faith, all work on these, and if you are taking a big unit of 10 of them, having a chaplain behind them to buff them up with rerolls to hit in melee or +1 to wound in shooting, those are all going to work, and they're all going to be awesome on a big Death Star unit like that. They also have the Gravis keyword, so they are unyielding in the face of the foe for a CP, which gives them an additional point of armor save against damage 1 weapons. Honestly, not a ton of damage 1 hitting right now, although if there is something like, lightning claws or something going into these guys, and it's not a White Scar wielding it, then you could potentially be buffing their save against that, which could potentially be pretty useful for them. I did mention some chapter command options that work really well with them. The Chief Apothecary, firstly, bringing back Gravis models is kind of the minimum of what you want to be doing with Chief Apothecaries. 3-wound models are excellent for them because a lot of times you'll be able to heal a model with the Apothecary ability, then also regenerate one, and a 6+ damage ignore on 30 wounds full of Intercessor is pretty good. The chapter Ancient as well has that Steadfast Example Warlord trait to give them an additional point of obsec if you need that on top of it. Looking at some specific chapter synergies, I think what we want to be doing with a Heavy Intercessor squad is focusing on its resilience. As a troops option with baked-in objective secured, I think the most interesting thing about them is that they are naturally very difficult to kill, and pushing that up through the roof is, I think, the direction that you want to be going in if you're taking these guys. Salamanders obviously have an enormous breadth of incredible options for them. All of their psychic powers work really well on big Death Star units like this. You can give them +1 toughness, making them toughness 6, which is a really good breakpoint for a lot of strength 5 and 6 weapons, which are really coming into the meta right now. I mean, heavy bolter spam is the thing, and making those heavy bolters wound on 5s is awesome. You can also make them -1 to be hit with Fire Shield. You can recreate the Apothecary Aura with an Obsidian Aquila. There's just a bunch of ways that Salamanders have to make this unit harder to kill, in addition to their chapter tactic, of course. And on top of that, if you are taking a big unit of Hellstorm bolt rifles, having +1 to wound on them with Crucible of Battle is always pretty good, since high volume attacks tend to benefit from those +1 to wound effects more than lower volume stuff. Iron Hands, for the same reason, also excellent for survivability. You have Size Steel armor to give them an additional point of armor save. You could potentially be getting these guys to a 1+ armor save, basically a Terminator with a Storm Shield against damage 1 weapon. So take that, everybody who is just shooting at them with a gun. Iron Hands also naturally gives them a 6+ damage ignore. You can get that down to a 5+ with Reject the Flesh, Embrace the Machine, which is pretty cool as well. I think one of the most interesting combinations is Imperial Fists or Crimson Fists. Anytime you're looking at bringing a lot of bolt weapons to the table, thinking about Imperial Fists or Crimson Fists is one direction that I think you could go in. Unfortunately, the change to the Imperial Fist super doctrine means that they do not buff heavy bolter weapons anymore. You have to be essentially autocannon equivalent or higher to benefit from that +1 damage against vehicles. Real shame, honestly. I think I would like to see that change overturned, because I do think Imperial Fists, they're not that good right now, and it would be really cool to have them, you know, have their super doctrine be useful. But I mean, it is what it is. And shooting like 10 Executor Bolt Rifles at somebody with 3 damage, I think maybe would be too good. No, probably not. It's fine. I think that's okay. But Imperial Fists obviously have a bunch of ways to buff your bolt guns, not only their chapter tactic, but also the bolter discipline stratagem as well. Can make your heavy bolters and those big strength 5 bolt rifle hits multiply even more. Imperial Fists also have several ways to improve their armor save, which is great. And Crimson Fists have access to an excellent warlord trait in Stoic Defender, which is basically Steadfast Example, but you don't have to take a chapter ancient, so you can just put that on whoever and make them double obsec. Tangentially, you can also give them a 4+ invulnerable save from Azrael in Dark Angels, but Dark Angels have so many more options for these big heavy infantry or heavy biker units that are very survivable. I don't really think that you're going to be looking at Heavy Intercessors in that chapter specifically. They have Deathwing command squads, so it just take some Deathwing command squads, everybody. The last chapter I want to mention is Deathwatch, and for the reason that Deathwatch actually use Heavy Intercessors in an entirely different way than any other chapter in the game. Normally, you'd just be taking a Heavy Intercessor squad in your army, and you'd be putting 5 or 10 models on the table, and they'd, you know, wander around and shoot some heavy bolters at people. But Deathwatch will base all of their Indomitor kill teams off 5 Heavy Intercessors to start with. Indomitor kill teams are one of the core backbone of the Deathwatch army. It gives you access to troops slot Inceptors and Eradicators, which is insanity. And a lot of the most successful Deathwatch builds will take a couple of those, or will just skew really heavily into taking a lot of Inceptors or Eradicators in your troops option. You make them all obsec, you can get a ton of them on the table, and it's just really cool. The Indomitor kill teams have the additional benefit of being able to add those Eradicators and Inceptors into a unit of Heavy Intercessors, which means you can use the Heavy Intercessors themselves as relatively inexpensive, relatively, you know, 28 points a model, ablative wounds for your actually very expensive Inceptors and Eradicators. A lot of times, I mean, you put 3 Eradicators on the table, your opponent's gonna, you know, try to look a plasma cannon at them and overcharge it and kill those guys immediately. With an Indomitor kill team, that's a lot harder, because you have these 5 idiots that can just take those big hits, and you can remove them first before the Eradicators die. So it's actually, if you're not combat squatting them out, it is a good way to keep Eradicators and those Inceptors alive a lot longer on the table. And you can use these big combined arms units as those bulwark units that we talked about to move up the table and be obsec and take a lot of fire, which Gravis Armor is pretty good at. Now, when this datasheet came out, I was really interested in looking at the heavy bolters in it, because I really didn't know which heavy bolter would be the best one, and I was really interested. So just for lulz, I did a statistical comparison of the different heavy bolters in the game. And so just for lulz, I did a statistical comparison of the different heavy bolters that the Heavy Intercessor squad can take. And as I do with all of these mathematical comparisons, I have put them up against some of the most common defensive stat lines in the game. Those are Guardsman equivalents being toughness 3 with 1 wound and a 5+ save, Marine equivalents being toughness 4 with a 3+ save and 2 wounds, and then Vehicle and Knight equivalents, which are toughness 7 and 8 respectively with a 3+ save, and if it matters, a 5+ invulnerable save. Now for those last 2, we determine how much raw damage we can do, and for Marines and Guards equivalents, we just see how many we can kill. Now typically for a Space Marine model, I count them in Tactical Doctrine, because that's where a lot of the fighting in the game takes place in 40k, and I'm gonna do that here. A lot of times for a heavy weapon, I count them as moving as well. I didn't do that here. It's going to affect all of the profiles the same, because they're all heavy weapons, so I just elected to give them a 3+ ballistic skill instead of a 4, and the results were, I think, pretty interesting, actually. I wholeheartedly expected Hellstorm bolt rifles to come out ahead of everything else. They are a little bit shorter range, so they don't get to shoot quite as often, but honestly, a 30-inch range is probably fine in 9th edition 40k. And the Hellstorm bolt rifle having an additional damage 2 shot over the other varieties, I thought was going to be really powerful. The difference between all these weapons is not great. Obviously, the Hellstorm bolt rifle and the standard heavy bolter, trading the extra shot for the extra AP is a pretty big deal. It makes that Hellstorm bolt rifle a little bit better against a Guardsman equivalent lightly armored unit, but the extra AP, you actually lose that efficiency when you're going up against something with a 3+ armor save. Now that's really interesting to me, because a heavy bolter is not a weapon that is really gonna want to focus on a toughness 3 model with 1 wound. You want to send your bolt gun equivalent shots at those and put the heavy bolters into something a little bit more meaty. So that actually says to me that despite the fact that I thought the Hellstorm bolt rifle was going to be great, the situation in which it's best is not really a situation where you want to be using a heavy bolter anyway. So kind of throw that one out. which is a little sad. R.I.P. Hellstorm Heavy Bolter. Now, interestingly as well, the way that the math works out on these, vehicle equivalent and a knight equivalent are going to be damaged identically. The only time where the knight equivalent is going to be a little bit harder to hit is when you are in Devastator Doctrine with an Executor Bolt Rifle, so that it actually bumps up against the 5+ invulnerable save rather than just punching the armor save down to a 6-up. That's not a situation that I mathed out in this case, so the vehicle equivalent and the knight equivalent are actually going to be identical. Now, the weirder thing is that Marine equivalents actually math identically to the vehicle and knight equivalents amount of damage that they sustain. This is mostly an idiosyncrasy of 40K's math all being like based on D6s. So a lot of times you basically are just trading different 17% increments in different areas depending on where you're shooting. And in this case for the Heavy Bolter, it actually meant that each variety of Heavy Bolter kills as many MEQs as it does damage to vehicles. Cool. You know, that's fun. For the regular Heavy Bolter, that means it does 0.66 damage per Heavy Bolter to a vehicle, or it kills 0.667 Marines. However, for the Executor Bolter, because it has an extra damage over top of what a Marine can take, it will kill 0.593 Marines every time it shoots. However, versus vehicle equivalents and knight equivalents, it is doing a lot more damage, 0.889 damage per Executor Bolt Rifle that you have in your unit. Now, obviously, none of these are actually particularly inspiring damage values. Like, you're not shooting a las cannon at someone and expecting like 2 or 3 damage to chip off of a tank. It's nice to have, but heavy bolters typically require a very high volume of them to be able to do a lot of damage. And unfortunately, they are a great weapon in volume, but having 1 per squad is not going to do a ton. Paying 10 points to deal an average of maybe 1 damage to a vehicle every turn is not an amazing return on your investment, especially since you're already losing 3 strength 5 shots that could potentially be chipping in a third of a damage or so by themselves. That said, given that the Executor Bolter is much better against heavier armored targets like vehicles and knights, and the fact that it's way better at shooting at things like, I don't know, other Heavy Intercessors, I do actually think that the Executor Heavy Bolter comes out on top here. Now, that said, I also think that the Hellstorm Bolt Rifle is probably the best bolt rifle to take in your unit, which means that more often, if you are taking a heavy weapon, you're going to be taking a Hellstorm Heavy Bolter. But honestly, I'm not even sure I would take a Heavy Bolter in these units if I didn't have the points. I think I would just be taking the, 15 strength 5 shots you can put 30 inches down range and just be happy with that. You can start picking stuff off objectives with that. Interestingly, something that you can't often do in 40K, you can reach from your backline objectives to central objectives or objectives in your opponent's deployment zone if you have clear lines of sight, and this unit can contribute some firepower while you're doing that, which I think is very interesting. Now, the fact that they are speed 5 means that a lot of times they will want to be advancing up the table so to make up for that low speed value, which is one of the reasons I think the Hellstorm Bolt Rifle is a good option for them, and one of the reasons I don't think a Heavy Bolter is all that necessary for them. Now, this is very much sort of a final verdict style discussion, so let's go ahead and move into the final verdict. Should you put Heavy Intercessors in your army? And honestly, I don't think so. I was really worried when this model got spoiled that this would be like a 23-point intercessor that got a Gravis stat line and would just supersede other intercessors, make Marines impossible to pull off objectives, and just be this like miserable garbage fire of a unit to deal with. And I think the potential was there for that to happen, but not at a 28-point price tag. Especially in 9th edition lists where, since points have been inflated to such an extent, in a Space Marine list where you really have to be trimming as much fat as possible to put as many elite, efficient damage dealers into your list, spending 40 additional points to get no additional models on the table in your troop slot where the damage that they do is not very efficient and you're paying a lot as a tax for the rest of your army to be able to unlock battalions and patrols and things, that's a lot of points to pay. For the cost it takes to upgrade your Intercessor squad to a Heavy Intercessor squad and give you, 5 extra wounds and maybe a little bit of a better gun, you could just buy an Eradicator who himself has 3 wounds and an insane gun. And that's the kind of arithmetic that Space Marine players are going to be needing to do when they're looking at putting units like this into their list. Is a Heavy Intercessor squad really going to be worth 40 points over top of a standard Intercessor squad? And the answer realistically is almost never. Now, that's not to say that I don't think Heavy Intercessors are, like, objectively bad, and there are going to be some lists that really want them. If you want a unit that can take some light indirect fire, that doesn't, sort of die when a 2-damage weapon looks at it, and can take a flank objective or a back objective and really reliably hold it, Heavy Intercessors are there for you. And I think that they will show up in competitive lists from time to time. I do want to note as well that I don't think the same rationale applies to Deathwatch lists. I think Heavy Intercessors are here to stay in Deathwatch specifically, and that is because that chapter uses them so drastically and mechanically differently than any other chapter in the game. Indomitor kill teams are one of the backbones of modern Deathwatch lists using the new supplement, and for that reason alone, Heavy Intercessors are going to show up in Deathwatch lists constantly. I think you're going to be hard-pressed to find a good competitive Deathwatch list that doesn't have at least 5 little Heavy Intercessors sitting in the back to babysit some Eradicators or some Inceptors. Honestly, this verdict has been tainted a little bit by the fact that the Heavy Intercessor squad is such a weird and sort of bizarre design. They're not quite resilient or hard-hitting enough to justify being a frontline unit. For example, if you compare them to Blade Guard veterans, while they have an additional point of toughness, they're lacking a point of armor save and an invulnerable save. And they also don't really threaten your opponent enough to make them back away and, not want to fight you over those objectives. They're just an intercessor. It seems like the datasheet was really focused on being a ranged attacker, as I mentioned earlier in the video, but they don't do that much damage in shooting, and it's a little bit odd that you would focus this expensive, high-resilience unit to a role that would, not be competing over objectives, where you're making most effective use out of that resilient stat line. I'm sure Heavy Intercessors will have a place at some point in the future, but right now it looks like kind of a half-baked, sort of weird redhead stepchild of a datasheet that doesn't really know its place in the Codex quite yet. So that's it. That's the Datasheet deep dive for today, everybody. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. As always, big thanks to my patrons over at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. You can go visit them and get all sorts of fun stuff. You get to vote on Datasheet deep dive topics, which is pretty sweet. You also get early access to T5S2 tournaments that we run over on the Discord. Speaking of the Discord, just come join. We talk about 40K and other miniature war games all the time, constantly, forever. Anyway, thanks again for watching. Hope everyone is having a wonderful new year and getting working on those hobby New Year's resolutions. And as always, keeping it classy, folks, and having happy wargaming. Oh, I messed up the end. God damn it.